She found out on a Tuesday, not from a letter, not from a rumor passed between the ranch hands over cold coffee. She found out because she walked into the feed store in Red Hollow to pick up a sack of cornmeal, and the owner, a thick-necked man named Gerald Peck, who had never once offered her so much as a civil nod, stepped out from behind the counter and pulled the door open for her like she was someone worth impressing. "Miss Hartwell," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I hope everything at Iron Creek is to your satisfaction." Mabel stopped walking. In 4 years of coming through that door, Gerald Peck had never learned her name. She said nothing. She took her cornmeal, paid her exact amount, and walked back to the wagon with her jaw set and her mind already turning over every quiet moment she had shared with the man she thought she knew. Silas Crowe. She had served him breakfast for 11 weeks. She had handed him his coffee, black, no sugar, every single morning without being asked, because she had noticed on the third day that he always reached for the pot himself when she forgot. She had watched him oil his own boots at the end of long days, mend a torn shirt without complaint, and fall asleep in a chair by the fire, like a man too tired to care what anyone thought of him. She had believed, without question, that he was simply a ranch hand, older than most, quieter than all of them. She had been wrong about almost everything. The Nebraska winter of 1881 did not apologize for itself. It came in hard and stayed hard, and the land around Iron Creek Ranch turned into something that looked less like a working farm and more like a punishment. The creek itself froze over in November and didn't soften until well past February. The cattle huddled against the fences. The barn roof developed a leak that the men patched 3 times before it finally held. The morning smelled like wood smoke and cold leather and the particular kind of quiet that only exists when the wind decides to rest for an hour. Mabel Hartwell had been at Iron Creek for 4 months by the time the worst of the cold set in, and she had learned to read the weather by the way the men came in for breakfast. If they stamped their boots hard at the door and said nothing, it was going to be a difficult day. If they came in talking, even arguing, there was room to breathe. Most days they came in stamping. There were 12 of them, not counting Silas, who she had placed in a separate category in her mind without quite meaning to. The others were loud in the uncomplicated way that men are loud when they spend too much time together. Jokes that weren't quite jokes, arguments over nothing that became arguments about everything, and a constant low-level negotiation over who was carrying more weight than someone else. She had managed kitchens before. She knew how to keep 12 men fed and more or less functional without losing her own mind in the process. She had learned, very early in her working life, that the kitchen was its own kind of power. The men could complain about the cold or the cattle or the foreman's decisions, but no one complained about the food if the cook was doing her job. And Mabel always did her job. What she hadn't expected at Iron Creek was Silas. He had arrived the same week she did, which she had thought was coincidence. He was introduced to her the same way the other men were introduced. First name only, no explanation of what he did or how long he'd been there. He shook her hand once, said it was good to meet her, and went to find his bunk. That was it. For the first several weeks, she paid him no more attention than she paid any of the others. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint. He was never late, never left a dish unfinished, and never asked for anything she hadn't already offered. He helped clear the table on the days when the other men were too tired to bother. He refilled the water pitcher without being asked. Small things. She noticed them because small things were her business. What she started noticing around week 3 was that the other men listened to Silas in a way they didn't quite listen to each other. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't the kind of authority that announces itself. When Pete Dunbar and Cal Moss got into a genuine argument over whose fault it was that a section of the south fence had been left unmended, it was Silas who said, quietly, that both of them could fix it tomorrow, and they'd be even. And somehow, that was the end of it. When the youngest hand, a 17-year-old named Tommy Briggs, who cried once in the cold when he thought no one was watching, came in pale and shaking after nearly losing 3 fingers to a piece of equipment, it was Silas who sat with him until the shaking stopped. He did it without drama, without any visible sense that he was doing something worth noting. Mabel filed it away. By week 5, she had developed a theory. Silas Crowe was a former foreman, maybe from another ranch, who had come to Iron Creek to finish out his working years in relative quiet. It would explain the authority he carried without claiming it. It would explain why no one questioned him, even though he held no official position that anyone had mentioned to her. It was a reasonable theory. It was also completely wrong. The morning she first had a real conversation with him, she was in the middle of a problem she hadn't yet solved. The ranch's food stores were running lower than they should have been for the point in the winter they'd reached. She had done her accounting twice, and both times the numbers told her the same uncomfortable story. Someone had been taking from the supply without logging it, and if it continued at the current rate, they would be short before the thaw. She wasn't going to announce it at the breakfast table. That would turn it into something loud and ugly, and she had been in enough kitchens to know that accusing 12 men of theft, even indirectly, created problems that outlasted the original problem. She was standing at the supply room shelf with a piece of paper and a pencil, doing the count for the third time, when she heard Boots stop in the doorway behind her. She turned around expecting Tommy Briggs, who had a habit of wandering into the kitchen looking for something to do when the cold kept him from working outdoors. It was Silas. He looked at the paper in her hand. He looked at the shelf. He didn't ask what she was doing because it was obvious what she was doing. "How short?" he said. She hesitated. It wasn't his business, technically, or she had assumed it wasn't. "Enough to matter," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a locked cabinet in the second storage room, behind the grain sacks. I'll have it open for you this afternoon." She stared at him. "What's in it?" "Backup provisions. Flour, salt pork, dried beans. Enough to carry the crew through another 6 weeks if it comes to that." She didn't know what to say for a moment. "Why is it locked?" He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the shadow of one. "Because I've managed long winters before," he said, "and I've learned it's better to have something in reserve that nobody knows about." He left before she could ask him anything else. She stood in the doorway of the supply room for a long moment, holding her paper and pencil, recalculating something that was not about flour. The locked cabinet was exactly where he said it would be. She found it that afternoon after the lunch dishes were cleared, with a key that Silas had left on the kitchen table without a word, while she was busy with her back turned. She hadn't heard him come in or leave. She had simply turned around and the key was there on the wood, plain as anything. The cabinet held 60 pounds of flour, a full side of salt pork, 2 large tins of dried beans, a smaller tin of coffee, and a bag of dried apple slices that she hadn't expected, and that made her stand very still for a moment, because dried apple slices were not a necessity. They were a comfort. Someone had put them there deliberately. She brought everything to the main stores and updated her accounting. The numbers now worked. She told herself that the key and the cabinet were simply practical matters. She told herself she was reading too much into dried apple slices. She told herself this several times, with decreasing conviction. The first real trouble at the ranch came in the 6th week, and it came from outside. A man named Harlan Teague rode in from the direction of Red Hollow on a gray morning when the sky looked like it was deciding whether or not to deliver more snow. He had 2 riders with him and a legal-looking document folded under his coat, and he asked to speak with whoever was in charge of Iron Creek Ranch. Mabel was the only one near the main house when he arrived. She told him she could take a message. Teague looked at her the way some men looked at women who were working. Not with hostility exactly, but with the specific kind of dismissal that didn't bother to form itself into an expression. "I'll wait for someone who can sign a document," he said. "What kind of document?" she asked. He ignored the question and dismounted, handing his reins to one of the men he'd brought. He walked past her toward the porch like the house already belonged to him. It was the kind of move that was designed to make a person feel small. Mabel had encountered it before, in other kitchens, on other properties, with other men who believed that the space they occupied was automatically theirs. She went inside, found the warmest spot near the stove, and started a fresh pot of coffee. 15 minutes later, Silas came in from the barn. He saw the 3 horses tied at the post. He saw Teague on the porch. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way she had started to recognize. A small, precise calculation happening behind a calm surface. He walked to the porch without hurrying. She watched through the window. She couldn't hear the whole conversation, but she could hear the tone of it. Teague was doing most of the talking. He unfolded his document at one point and held it out toward Silas. Silas looked at it without touching it. He said something. Teague said something else, louder. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Silas said something very quiet that she couldn't hear at all. Teague refolded his document. 2 minutes later, all 3 of them rode away. She had the coffee ready when Silas came back inside. He sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands around the mug she set in front of him. "What did he want?" she asked. She understood by now that asking him directly was more likely to produce an answer than not asking. "He wants to buy the water rights on the east side of the property," Silas said. And? And I told him they weren't for sale. He seemed unhappy about that. He was. Silas drank his coffee. "He'll be back." She sat down across from him. This was, she realized, the first time she had sat across from him at the kitchen table. She had always stood, always been in motion, serving or cleaning or organizing. Sitting felt different, more direct. "Is there something I should know?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. He had gray eyes that were difficult to read, not because they concealed everything, but because they seemed to contain too many things at once: tiredness and attention, and something that might have been, if she were reading it correctly, a kind of careful respect. "Not yet," he said. It wasn't an evasion, it was a statement of timing. She could tell the difference. She refilled his coffee and went back to work. The thing about sustaining a kitchen through a hard winter was that it required a kind of daily renegotiation with failure. Nothing was guaranteed. The fire could go cold in the night. The supplies could run short. The equipment could break at the worst possible moment. Mabel had cracked 3 wooden spoons in the last month alone, not from carelessness, but from cold, which made everything more brittle. She replaced them from a supplied drawer without complaint and kept cooking. This was the work. Not the moments when everything came together cleanly, but the 10,000 small decisions made before sunrise and after sunset that held the whole enterprise upright. The men began noticing things around week 7, not consciously. Men like that didn't tend to narrate their observations, but she could feel it in the way they moved through the kitchen, slightly less careless, slightly more aware that someone was working very hard to keep their lives comfortable. Pete Dunbar started bringing in extra firewood without being asked. Cal Moss, who had never once said anything she could classify as a compliment, told her once that the biscuits were not bad. From Cal Moss, this was practically a standing ovation. Tommy Briggs just said, "Thank you, Miss Mabel," every single day, twice a day, like he was afraid she might forget that someone noticed. She hadn't expected to feel settled here. She had taken the position at Iron Creek because the pay was fair, and the alternative was going back to Omaha to stay with her sister's crowded household and pretend she wasn't struggling. She had told herself it was temporary, a winter position. She would leave in the spring and find something better. But the kitchen at Iron Creek had started to feel like hers. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. Harlan Teague came back on a Thursday. This time he came alone, and he came to the kitchen door, which told her something about how his thinking had changed since the first visit. The front door was for business. The kitchen door was for something else. She opened it and looked at him. He was a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, with the particular kind of confident posture that came from having money long enough to forget what it felt like not to have it. He had small eyes and a wide mouth and a way of standing that took up slightly more space than he needed. "I'm looking for the cook," he said. "You found her," Mabel said. "I understand you have the ear of the hands here." He said it like he was offering her something. "I'm a reasonable man, Miss Hartwell. Miss Hartwell. I'm a reasonable man. What I'm proposing for Iron Creek Ranch is fair compensation, more than fair. I simply need someone to help the owner understand the opportunity." She looked at him steadily. "The owner seems to understand the opportunity fine." "He's being stubborn. He's being clear," she said. "There's a difference." Teague looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had come to the kitchen door expecting to find someone he could work with. He had found something else. "There's money in this for everyone," he said, "including the household staff." She understood then what he was actually doing. He was attempting to buy her. "I'm not household staff," she said. "I'm the cook, and the kitchen is mine to run. This conversation is finished." She closed the door. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this as she went back to the stove. She had expected them to shake. They didn't. She told Silas at dinner. Not dramatically. She simply described what had happened while she was clearing the plates, the same way she would report that the east window was drafting again, or that the flour supply needed restocking. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "He offered you money," Silas said. "He implied it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the kitchen is mine to run," she said, "and then I closed the door." He looked at her. that same gray, careful gaze. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, plain and direct. She believed them completely. The trip to Red Hollow happened on a clear afternoon in the middle of week 11, when the weather offered a brief window of something approaching reasonable, and she needed to resupply before it closed again. She brought Tommy Briggs to help carry, and they made the drive in one of the smaller wagons. At the feed store, Gerald Peck opened the door for her. She thought about that all the way to the land office, where she had intended to stop and pick up a survey map that one of the hands had asked about, something to do with the property line on the south pasture, and an ongoing argument with a neighboring farmer about where exactly one man's land ended and another's began. The land registrar was a small, precise man who found her the survey map efficiently and without conversation. She was folding it when something on the wall caught her eye. A posted property record, current ownership documents, displayed publicly as required by the county. Iron Creek Ranch. She read the name once. Then she read it again. Silas Crowe. Not a company name, not a distant investor's name, not the name of a man who had hired Silas to manage his land. The name was Silas Crowe, and the property described was every acre of Iron Creek Ranch, the land, the water rights, the structures, the cattle. She stood very still in the land office for a long moment. Tommy Briggs was saying something beside her. She didn't hear it. She thought about 11 weeks of breakfast, 11 weeks of black coffee, no sugar. 11 weeks of a man who fixed things before anyone asked him to, who sat at the middle of the table instead of the head, who had left a key on the kitchen counter and never mentioned it again. She thought about Gerald Peck and his sudden particular interest in knowing her name. She thought about Harlan Teague coming to the kitchen door. She folded the survey map and put it under her arm. "We're ready to go," she said to Tommy Briggs. She walked out of the land office and climbed into the wagon and picked up the reins. She had a question she intended to ask. She had not yet decided how she was going to ask it, but she was going to ask it because Mabel Hartwell had spent 31 years learning that the things you chose not to say had a way of becoming the things you most regretted. The wagon moved north, back toward Iron Creek, and the question settled in her chest like a stone in still water. She kept her eyes on the road. She kept her hands steady on the reins, but her mind had already arrived at the kitchen, at the table where a man who owned everything had been sitting quietly for 11 weeks, pretending to be no one at all, and waiting to see what kind of person she really was. And what she felt, underneath the surprise and the confusion and the first edges of something that might eventually become anger, was this. She was going to need a very good reason, because without one, what he had done was not a test, it was a deception. And Mabel Hartwell had been deceived before, by people she'd trusted more than she'd intended to, and she had learned, the hard and permanent way, that she would not be made a fool of twice. The road stretched out ahead of her, hard and cold and honest as anything the frontier had ever offered. She drove toward it without slowing down. She didn't confront him that evening. She almost did. She came back to Iron Creek with the survey map under her arm, and Tommy Briggs chattering beside her about whether the farrier in Red Hollow had overcharged them for the horseshoe nails. And she climbed down from the wagon and handed the reins to Pete Dunbar and walked straight into the kitchen. And Silas was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper he was reading, and she looked at him, and she said nothing. She put the survey map on the shelf above the dry goods cabinet. She stirred the pot of beans that had been simmering since noon. She sliced the bread she had set to cool that morning and arranged it on the board for supper. She did not look at him again. He didn't leave immediately. He sat with his coffee for another 10 minutes, and she was aware of him the entire time. The particular stillness of a man who knows something has shifted and is waiting to find out what it means. She had spent enough years reading the atmosphere of a room to know that he was watching her. Not staring, just aware. The same way he was always aware of everything around him, which she now understood in a completely different light. He left before supper without saying anything. She served 12 men their beans and bread and didn't drop a single dish. But after the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked and the last lamp was turned down, she sat at the table alone and looked at her own hands for a long time. 31 years old. She had been cooking professionally since she was 19, when her mother got sick and the family needed money fast, and Mabel was the one who was good at the one thing people always needed. She had cooked in boarding houses and cattle camps, and one very brief, very miserable stint in a hotel in Omaha, where the owner watched the flour levels like a man expecting theft and paid her accordingly, meaning badly and irregularly. She had learned, through all of it, a specific kind of economy, not just of food and supplies, but of herself. She did not give more than a situation warranted. She did not trust quickly. She did not mistake kindness for safety or competence for character. And somehow, in 11 weeks at Iron Creek Ranch, she had done all three. She had trusted a man she didn't know. She had mistaken his quiet competence for the straightforwardness of a working man with nothing to hide. And she had been kind to him, genuinely, unguardedly kind, in the small and daily ways that she reserved for people she had actually decided deserved it. She hadn't decided. She had simply done it. And the whole time he had known exactly who he was and exactly what she didn't know. The question she kept returning to, in the silence of the kitchen, was not whether she was angry. She was. The question was whether the anger was proportionate to what he had actually done. Because she was self-aware enough to know that her anger had a tendency to run ahead of her reasoning, and she did not like making decisions from the front of that particular stampede. He hadn't been cruel to her. He hadn't used her. He hadn't taken anything she hadn't freely offered. He had simply let her believe something that wasn't true. And she didn't know yet whether that was a forgivable thing or whether it was the kind of thing that changed a person's standing permanently. She went to bed without deciding. The morning was gray and mean, the kind that Iron Creek specialized in, with a wind that came down from the north and found every gap in the walls it could. Mabel had the stove going by 4:30 and the coffee ready before anyone else was awake, which was the way she preferred it. The hour before the men came in was the only time the kitchen was completely hers, and she had learned to guard it. She was measuring out the cornmeal for porridge when she heard the back door. It was Silas. He came in the same way he always did. Boots scraped on the mat, coat hung on the second peg from the left, hat on the hook above it. He moved to the stove and stood near it without crowding her, which was something she had noticed about him from the beginning. He always found the edge of a space rather than the center of it. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the corner of the work table without looking at him. "Mabel," he said. "The porridge will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. "That's not what I know what you were going to say," she said. She kept her voice level. Not cold, but flat in the way that voices go flat when they are working hard to stay controlled. "And I'm asking you to wait until after breakfast, because I have 12 men to feed and I am not going to have this conversation while the cornmeal is on the fire." A silence. "All right," he said. He took his coffee to the table and sat down, and he was quiet, and she cooked the porridge, and neither of them spoke again until the other men started coming in, and the kitchen filled with noise and cold air and the ordinary chaos of morning at Iron Creek Ranch. She fed them, she cleared, she washed. By the time the kitchen was empty and the morning work was done, it was past 8 o'clock and the men had scattered to their tasks, and the wind had picked up outside to a degree that made outdoor work genuinely miserable. She could hear it pressing against the walls. Silas came back. He had been outside. She could tell from the way the cold was still coming off his coat. He sat at the table again, in the same chair as always. The middle of the table. Not the head. She understood now why he always sat there. She dried her hands on her apron and sat down across from him. Same as she'd done once before, in the early weeks, when she'd asked him what Teague wanted. Except this time was different, and they both knew it. "How long have you owned Iron Creek?" she asked. 7 years, he said. "And you've been working it yourself for all 7? "Most of it, yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He took a moment before he answered, which she was learning was simply how he operated. Not because he was deciding what to lie about, but because he seemed constitutionally unwilling to say anything he hadn't thought through first. "When I bought this land," he said, "I was a different kind of man. I had money from my father's estate and not much else. I hired a full staff in the first year. Foreman, hands, housekeeper, cook. Paid them well. Treated them, I thought, fairly." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "What I found out over time was that the moment people knew who I was, they became a version of themselves that had very little to do with who they actually were. The foreman told me what he thought I wanted to hear. The hands worked hard when I was watching and barely at all when I wasn't. The cook made elaborate meals when I had guests and fed the hands near nothing when I was traveling." He paused. "I let 2 of those men go. One of the others quit when he realized I wasn't going to keep overlooking things. I ended up doing most of the work myself and hiring carefully, one or two at a time. And hiding who you were, Mabel said. And not advertising it, he said. There's a difference. Is there? It wasn't quite a question. He heard that. I didn't tell you a lie, he said. I just didn't tell you a truth you didn't ask about. You let me treat you like a hired hand for 11 weeks, she said. I handed you work assignments. I told you where to sit. I once told you that if you wanted more biscuits, you were going to have to wait like everyone else. Something crossed his face. Not amusement, exactly. More like the memory of something that had mattered to him, briefly visible before he put it back where it lived. I remember, he said. Does that strike you as right? She asked. That I would have managed you the same way I managed Tommy Briggs, while you knew the whole time that you owned the land under my feet? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It doesn't strike me as right. It strikes me as something I needed, and I took it without asking your permission, and I understand if that sits badly with you. She looked at him. The thing about Silas Crowe, she was realizing, was that he was honest in a way that was almost inconvenient. He didn't soften things to make them easier to accept. He didn't dress up an admission in enough polite language that you could pretend it was something other than what it was. He said the hard thing plainly, and then waited to see what you did with it. She had not expected that. Why me? She asked. You hired me 4 months ago. You must have done the same thing before with other cooks, other staff. Not the same way, he said. I've kept my name off things before, managed through a foreman who handled the hiring. This time I was here myself, from the start. He looked at the table. You came with a straightforward reference from the Hollis Ranch outside Lincoln. You'd cooked there for 2 years. The family said you were dependable, didn't complain, and never once took more from the pantry than you'd been given. They said they'd have kept you forever except the wife's mother came to live with them, and she had her own ideas about the kitchen. A pause. I hired you because you sounded like a woman who did what she said she'd do. I stayed quiet about who I was because I wanted to know whether that was actually true. And, Mabel said. He looked at her directly. You're exactly what they said you were. She sat with that for a moment. She had received compliments before. She had been told she was a fine cook, a hard worker, a reliable woman. Those things mattered to her in the way that any honest assessment of good work matters to a person who takes their work seriously. This felt different. This felt like someone had looked at the whole of her, not just the output, but the structure of her, and reported back what they found. She wasn't sure yet whether she was grateful for that or furious about it. I need you to understand something, she said. Her voice was still level. She was proud of that. What I did in this kitchen, I did because it was my job, and because these men needed someone to do it well. Not because I was performing for you, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone. When I baked the extra bread on the cold nights, it wasn't a test I was passing, it was just bread. When I sat with Tommy after his hand got hurt and he couldn't stop shaking, I wasn't thinking about what anyone would think of me for doing it. I just did it because it needed doing. I know, Silas said. Then I need you to understand that my character is not something you get credit for discovering, she said. It exists whether or not anyone is watching. And the fact that you were watching, without telling me, doesn't make you wise. It makes you a man who used another person's honesty for his own purposes. The words landed. She could see that they did. He didn't flinch, but there was a stillness in him that told her something had registered. That's fair, he said. I know it's fair, she said. I'm not asking for your agreement. I'm telling you where I stand. She got up and went back to the stove, because there were things that needed doing, and she was not the kind of woman who let a difficult conversation stop the work. She set water to heat for the midday meal. She checked the bread she had put to rise before breakfast. Silas didn't leave. He sat at the table in the middle chair, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold, and she moved around the kitchen and he stayed where he was. And after a while, the silence between them stopped being tense and started being something else. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile either. Something in the middle. A working silence. The kind that exists between two people who have said the necessary things and are now figuring out what comes next. Teague is going to make another move, Silas said eventually. She glanced at him. What kind of move? He's been buying up water rights on the east side of the county for the past 2 years. methodical about it. Most of the smaller ranchers have sold, some of them because they needed the money, and some of them because he made it uncomfortable enough not to. He turned the cold mug in his hands. The east water access on Iron Creek is the last piece he needs to control the flow for about 30 miles of grazing land. Without it, his plan doesn't work. With it, he can charge whatever he wants for water access, and half the ranchers in this county will have no choice but to pay. Mabel thought about the man who had come to the kitchen door, his careful posture, the way he'd tried to position himself as reasonable before attempting to purchase her cooperation. "He's not going to stop," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to hold the line and see what he does next. And I'm going to need people around me that I can trust." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what this conversation is?" He met her eyes. "It's part of it." She turned back to the stove. What she didn't say, because she wasn't ready to say it yet, was that some part of the anger she was carrying was sitting on top of something else. Something she liked even less than the anger, because the anger was clean and the thing underneath it was not. The thing underneath it was that she understood him. Not the secrecy. She didn't understand that, and she was not prepared to excuse it. But she understood the impulse beneath it. The experience of not being sure who was seeing you versus who was seeing what you had. The particular loneliness of that uncertainty. She had spent 11 weeks in a kitchen that wasn't hers, feeding men who saw a cook when they looked at her, and rarely much more. She had learned to find her worth inside the work itself, because that was the only place no one could take it from her. Silas Crowe had apparently learned a version of the same lesson from the opposite direction. That didn't make what he'd done right, but it made it human. She resented, slightly, that she could see that. The trouble started on a Wednesday, which was the same day Mabel had designated for baking, a full day's worth, enough to carry the house through the week, and she was deep in the middle of it when Pete Dunbar came through the back door at a speed that told her something was wrong before he said a word. "There's a man at the south gate," he said. "Two men, actually. They've got a document from the county assessor's office." Mabel wiped her hands. "What kind of document?" "The kind that says there's a disputed claim on the east water access," Pete said. He was a thick-set man in his 40s who very rarely got rattled, and he looked rattled. "They want to post a notice on the property line." She looked at him for a moment, then passed him toward the barn, where Silas would most likely be. "Go get Silas," she said. "Don't run. Walk like nothing's wrong." Pete looked at her. "Why?" "Because two men watching from the south gate don't need to know that their arrival is news," she said. "Go." He went. She kept baking, because stopping would not help anything, and because the bread still needed to be baked regardless of what Harlan Teague was doing with the county assessor's office. She punched down the second rise of dough with more force than was strictly necessary. 15 minutes later, Silas came through the back door with Pete behind him. He had the look of a man who had been expecting something like this and was not pleased that it had arrived. "What do you know about a disputed claim on the east water access?" she asked before he could speak. He pulled off his gloves. "Teague filed a counterclaim last month. Said there's historical evidence that the water access was transferred in an arrangement that predates my ownership. Is that true?" "No," he said, with a flatness that left no room for uncertainty. "It's fabricated. He found a man willing to say he had a verbal agreement with the previous owner. No documentation, no witnesses, just a claim." "That's enough to create a legal problem," she said. "It's enough to create delay," he said. "Which is what he wants. A disputed claim means I can't make improvements to the east section without risking challenge. It also makes it harder to hold the existing hands because nobody wants to work land that's in legal question." Mabel looked at the dough in front of her. "How many of the men know?" "As of this morning, none of them." "They'll find out," she said. "Men at a south gate with county documents aren't quiet about why they're there." "I know." "You need to tell them yourself before someone else does," she said. "Tonight, at supper." He looked at her. "If they hear it from you, they can decide whether to stay based on what you tell them," she said. "If they hear it from someone else, they'll feel like they were kept in the dark, and they'll leave not because the situation is unworkable, but because they don't trust you." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. She made a better supper than usual that night, not because she was trying to soften a difficult conversation with food, She was too practical for that, but because she knew from long experience that men received hard information more steadily when they were not hungry. Hunger made everything worse. It was a thing she had observed so many times it had stopped feeling like an insight and started feeling like fact. She made salt pork and roasted turnips and the last of the dried apple slices from the locked cabinet, cooked down with a little water and shaped into something that was not quite a dessert but was close enough to one that it counted. Silas told them at the table, after the main meal was cleared and the coffee was poured. He told them plainly the counterclaim, Teague's strategy, what it meant for the ranch in the immediate term, and what he intended to do about it. He didn't dramatize it, and he didn't minimize it. He said there was a legal problem, that it was going to take time to resolve, and that he understood if any man felt the situation was more uncertain than he was comfortable with. He said if anyone wanted to leave, he'd pay them through the end of the month and write them a reference without ill will. The kitchen was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Cal Moss, who had never in 11 weeks said anything that could be classified as a speech, put down his coffee mug and said, "I've been working Nebraska ranches for 22 years. Every single one of them had a legal problem of some kind at some point. It's land. It's what land does." He looked at Silas. "You feed us, you pay us, and you don't jerk us around. That's enough for me." Nobody left. Mabel, standing at the stove with her back to the table, allowed herself a small, private exhale. The following week was harder than any week that had come before it, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Silas had ridden to Red Hollow to consult with the county recorder about the claim documentation, and while he was gone, Harlan Teague's men started doing something quiet and deliberate and ugly. They began talking, not to the Iron Creek hands directly, nothing so obvious, but in town, in the feed store, at the post office, in the places where information moved between people without anyone having to own the source of it. The story they were spreading was that Iron Creek Ranch was financially unstable, that Silas Crowe was overextended, that the water dispute was just the visible piece of a larger problem, and any man who stayed on there would be looking for new work by summer. Mabel found out about it from Tommy Briggs, who had gone into Red Hollow for nails and come back looking like a man who wasn't sure what to do with what he was carrying. He told her in the kitchen, while she was working, with the door closed and his hat in his hands. She listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions. Then she told him to go find Pete Dunbar and Cal Moss and bring them to the kitchen without making a production of it. When all 3 of them were standing in her kitchen, she said, "I need you to understand something about what Teague is doing because I need you to be able to say it clearly to anyone in town who repeats this story to you." They looked at her. "A man who has a legitimate legal claim doesn't need to spread rumors about financial instability," she said. "He goes to court. He presents his documentation. He wins or he loses on the merits. The reason Teague is talking instead of litigating is because his claim doesn't hold up and he knows it. What he's hoping is that the uncertainty alone will do his work for him, that the hands will leave, the operation will weaken, and Silas will sell the water rights just to make the problem go away." She looked at each of them in turn. "If you know that, you're not afraid of the rumors. You're just watching a man bluff." Pete Dunbar looked at her for a moment. "How do you know his claim doesn't hold up?" "Because Silas told me," she said, plainly, without qualification. "And I've been in enough situations to know the difference between a man who's hiding something and a man who's telling you something hard he'd rather not be telling you." Cal Moss said nothing, but he nodded once, with the particular gravity of a man who had just updated his understanding of a situation. Silas came back from Red Hollow the following evening. He came into the kitchen late after supper was long over and the other men were in the bunkhouse, and she had kept a plate warm for him because it was what she did, and she saw no reason to stop doing it on account of the complicated thing that was currently existing between them. He sat down and ate without ceremony, the way he always did. She poured coffee. "The recorder confirmed the documentation on Teague's claim is incomplete," he said, between bites. "He's missing a signature from the original transfer. Without it, the claim can be challenged." "Can it be challenged quickly?" "Not quickly," he admitted, "but it can be challenged." She sat down across from him. "Teague has been talking in town." He looked up from his plate. She told him what Tommy had heard. All of it. Silas listened with the careful, unmoving attention he gave to things that mattered. When she finished, he said, "What did you do?" "I told Pete, Cal, and Tommy what I just told you," she said. that a man with a real case goes to court, and that the three of them should say the same to anyone who repeats it. He was quiet for a moment. You did that on your own? Yes. Without knowing whether I'd want you to. I made a judgment, she said. I thought it was the right one. If you disagree, you can tell me. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with his half-eaten plate in front of him and his coat still on because he'd come straight in without stopping. I don't disagree, he said. She got up and refilled his coffee. There was a night, near the end of that second month, when the wind got bad enough that the noise of it was constant, a low, unrelenting press against the walls that had a way of making the inside of a room feel both warmer and more fragile than usual. Mabel had banked the kitchen fire high and was mending a tear in one of the kitchen curtains, which was not strictly her job but also not something anyone else was going to do, when she heard someone in the main room. She went to look. Silas was sitting at the table near the front window, not doing anything in particular. He had a piece of paper in front of him and a pen, but he wasn't writing. He was looking at the frosted glass of the window, and he had the expression of a man who was trying to work out something that kept resisting resolution. She stood in the doorway for a moment. You should sleep, she said. Probably, he agreed. She didn't leave. He looked at her. In the bad light from the single lamp on the table, he looked older than she'd registered before, not in a deteriorating way, but in the way of a man who had been carrying weight for long enough that it had settled into his face. You asked me why I hid who I was, he said. I gave you the honest answer, but I didn't give you all of it. She waited. My wife knew who I was, he said, from the first day. I didn't hide anything from her. She understood this land, this life. She built as much of it as I did. He looked at the paper in front of him without really seeing it. She died 4 years ago. Fever. It was fast. A pause. After that, I didn't see the point of being Silas Crowe, the landowner, anymore, because she was the person who made that mean something. So I became just Silas. It was easier. The room was quiet, except for the wind. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said. It was plain and direct and meant exactly what it said. He nodded. Once. I'm not telling you that to excuse what I did, he said. I'm telling you because you asked me a real question and you deserve the real answer. She stood in the doorway a moment longer. Get some sleep, Silas, she said. Tomorrow is still going to need doing regardless. She went back to the kitchen. She sat down with her mending and the fire and the sound of the wind. And she thought about a woman she had never met who had apparently understood this particular man in a way that took years and proximity and something she didn't have a clean word for. And she thought about what it meant to build something with a person and then lose the person while the thing you built was still standing. She thought about that for a long time. The curtain eventually got mended. The fire burned down to coals. Outside, the wind kept pressing at the walls of Iron Creek Ranch, testing every seam, looking for a way through, and finding, for the time being, that the walls held. The curtain she had mended that night held through the rest of the winter without tearing again. Small victories were still victories. Mabel had learned that early, and she held to it now, in the weeks following the conversation by the lamp, as the situation with Teague moved from uncomfortable into something that required more careful attention than discomfort alone. It was the letter that changed the temperature of things. It arrived on a Friday, carried in by Tommy Briggs, along with the usual supply deliveries from Red Hollow, and it was addressed to Silas Crowe in handwriting that was precise and formal in the way of someone who had paid for a good education and wanted you to know it. Tommy left it on the kitchen table because Silas wasn't in the house, and Mabel left it exactly where it was because she had very firm ideas about other people's correspondence. But she noticed the return address, Teague Land and Water Holdings, Red Hollow, Nebraska. She noticed also that the envelope was thicker than a single sheet of paper. She went back to her work. Silas came in an hour later, saw the envelope, and picked it up without comment. He read it standing at the kitchen table, which was how he read things he expected to be unpleasant, on his feet, as if sitting down would make him less ready for whatever the words contained. His face did not change while he read. That, she had learned, was its own kind of signal. He set the letter down when he was finished and stood with his hands flat on the table for a moment. What is it? She asked. He's offering to buy the entire ranch, Silas said. She stopped what she was doing. Not just the water rights. No. He picked the letter back up and looked at it again. The full property, land, cattle, structures. He's offering a price that's approximately 60% of what it's worth. That's not an offer, she said. That's an insult. It's a message, he said. He's telling me he thinks my position is weak enough that I'll take 60 cents on the dollar to be done with it. She looked at him. Is your position that weak? He was quiet for a moment, and that moment cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw. Honesty, when the honest answer made you look bad, required a particular kind of discipline. The legal challenge is going to take longer than I initially thought, he said. The county recorder tells me the circuit judge won't be back through this jurisdiction until late spring. Until the claim is formally dismissed, I can't get clear financing on any improvements, which means the east pasture fence, which needs replacing before the spring thaw makes the ground workable, either comes out of operating cash I don't have or it doesn't get done. And if it doesn't get done? I lose cattle in the east pasture when they find the weak sections, he said. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Mabel looked at the letter on the table. What does he know about your financing situation? She asked. More than I'd like, Silas said. He has connections at the county bank. Not illegal ones, just the ordinary kind, where a man with money and a good relationship with a loan officer finds out things about other men's accounts that he was never officially told. She thought about that. The shape of it. A man constructing a problem from the outside. The legal claim to create uncertainty. The rumors to weaken the workforce. And now the lowball offer to arrive at exactly the moment when the uncertainty had done enough damage to make desperation a reasonable possibility. It was methodical. It was patient. It was the work of someone who had done this before. He's done this to other ranches, she said. It was not a question. 3 that I know of in this county, Silas said. 2 sold. One held out long enough that Teague lost interest and moved on. What did the one who held out do differently? Silas looked at her. He had a brother-in-law on the county commission who made things uncomfortable for Teague's financing. So he had a connection that Teague couldn't outmaneuver. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. The stove needed attention. She could hear the fire settling. And she went to it and adjusted the damper and came back to the table. Who do you have? She asked. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the bones of one. Apparently I have you, he said. I'm serious. So am I. Well, she had not thought of herself, before that conversation, as someone with particular influence. She was a cook. She ran a kitchen. She kept 12 men fed and functional through a Nebraska winter, which required competence and endurance and a certain stubbornness of purpose. But it was not the kind of work that translated into leverage in legal or financial matters. What she had, she began to understand in the days following the letter, was something different and more practical than leverage. She had information. Not secrets. She was not in the business of secrets, having developed a thorough dislike of them, but the kind of detailed, granular knowledge of a place and its people that only comes from being the one who feeds them. She knew which of the hands were sending money home and would stay as long as the pay held. She knew that Pete Dunbar had a cousin who worked for a land surveying company in Lincoln because Pete had mentioned it once while eating the kind of meal that makes people talkative. She knew that the minister in Red Hollow, a small, wiry man named Aldous Greer, who came out to the ranch twice a year for reasons that had never been fully explained to her, had some kind of long-standing dislike of Harlan Teague because he had once, in her presence, described Teague as a man whose word is a weather vane, and then looked like he regretted saying it out loud. She began, quietly and without announcing it, to think about which of those things might be useful. The first thing she did was talk to Pete Dunbar. She did it over the dishwashing on a Monday morning, which was the best time to talk to Pete because he always found a reason to linger in the kitchen after breakfast rather than go back out into the cold, and she had stopped pretending not to notice this a long time ago. Your cousin, she said, the one who does land surveying in Lincoln. Pete looked up from the mug he was supposedly rinsing. Hector? Does he survey water boundaries? That's most of what he does. Pete set the mug down carefully. Why? Because the dispute on the east water access is based on a claim about where the historical boundary of the water rights sites, she said. If that boundary were surveyed independently, not by the county, not by anyone connected to Teague, And the survey showed the boundary is exactly where Silas says it is. That's a document that can be filed against the counterclaim. Pete was quiet for a moment. Hector charges for his work. I assumed he did, Mabel said. I'm not asking him to do it free. I'm asking whether he'd be willing to do it, and how quickly, and what it would cost. He might know someone who could do it faster, Pete said, slowly, in the way of a man who was thinking about how pieces fit together. There's a fellow he works with who does rush surveys, costs more. How much more? I don't know, I'd have to ask. Would you ask? Pete looked at her for a long moment. He was a careful man, not suspicious, but measured. He did not do things without understanding why he was doing them. Does Silas know you're asking me this? No, she said. I'm going to tell him about it before anything moves forward, but I wanted to know first whether the option existed. Pete nodded slowly. I'll write Hector tonight. She told Silas that evening. She had waited until after supper, until the kitchen was clear and the noise of the bunkhouse had settled into its usual distant murmur, and she sat down across from him at the middle of the table and laid it out plainly. What she had asked Pete, what Pete had said, what the next step would be. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, You went around me. I gathered information before bringing it to you, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her. The gray eyes doing their complicated calculation. There is a difference, he allowed. But I'd like to be part of the decision before options are presented to my employees as possibilities. Noted, she said. Do you want to pursue it or not? He was quiet for a moment. How much does Pete trust his cousin's work? He asked. Enough to recommend him, she said. And Pete doesn't recommend things carelessly. You know that. He did know that. She watched him acknowledge it. Write the letter, he said. I'll pay for the survey. I already assumed you would, she said. I wasn't going to ask Pete's cousin to do it out of kindness. Something shifted in his face. Not quite amusement, but close to it. You're a difficult woman to stay ahead of, he said. I'm not trying to stay ahead of you, she said. I'm trying to solve the problem. I know, he said. That's what I mean. The survey letter went out on a Tuesday. The response came back in 8 days, which was fast for a Nebraska winter, when the mail rode on whatever combination of horse and determination was available. Pete's cousin Hector wrote that he could arrange a surveyor to be at Iron Creek within 3 weeks, weather permitting, and that the cost would be a figure that made Mabel wince slightly when Silas read it aloud, but which Silas accepted without visible reaction, because he had made a decision and he did not revisit decisions once they were made. In the meantime, Teague was not idle. He sent a second letter. This one was shorter and less formal in tone, and it said, essentially, that the offer on the table had a deadline, end of the month, and that after that date the terms would change. The letter did not specify how the terms would change. That vagueness was deliberate, and they both understood why. He wants you to imagine the worst, Mabel said, when Silas showed her the letter. He's good at this, Silas said. There was something in his voice, not admiration, but a kind of flat recognition of competence in an opponent that she respected more than she expected to. What's his deadline? She asked. End of February. That's 3 weeks, roughly. The surveyor will be here before then, she said. The survey doesn't fix the legal problem, Silas said. It strengthens our position. There's a difference. The counterclaim still has to be formally dismissed by a judge. Then we need to find a way to accelerate that, she said. He looked at her. Short of bribing a judge, which I am not going to do, I don't know how to move a court schedule. You can't move the schedule, she said, but you can make this filing strong enough that when the judge does come through, the dismissal is not a close question. She thought for a moment. What's missing from Teague's claim? You said the signature on the original transfer was incomplete. The previous owner's signature is there. The witness signature is missing. Who was the witness supposed to be? Silas was quiet for a moment. The claim lists a man named Rupert Calloway. He was the county recorder's assistant at the time of the original transfer. Is he still alive? Another pause. Longer. I don't know, Silas said. She looked at him. Then we need to find out. Finding out about Rupert Calloway took 4 days and the cooperation of someone Mabel had not expected to be useful. The minister, Aldous Greer, came out to the ranch on a Thursday for reasons that continued to be unspecified, and Mabel offered him coffee and a slice of bread with the apple butter she had put up in the fall, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked him, with no preamble, what he knew about a man named Rupert Calloway, who had worked for the county recorder approximately 9 years ago. Greer looked at her over his coffee mug with the expression of a man reassessing a person he thought he had categorized. "Why?" he said. "Because his name appears on a document connected to a legal dispute involving this ranch," she said, "and I need to know if he's alive, and if so, where." Greer set down his mug. He was a small man, as she had noted, with quick eyes and the kind of stillness that comes from years of listening to things people say in difficult moments. "Rupert Calloway moved to Kearney about 5 years ago," Greer said. "He has a daughter there who married a shopkeeper. He was not, as I understand it, a particularly honest man during his time with the county recorder's office." Mabel looked at him steadily. "How dishonest?" "The kind that could be persuaded, under certain circumstances, to record things in ways that were not entirely accurate." Greer picked up his mug again. "I say this not as gossip, but as relevant information, since you're apparently trying to determine the reliability of something he may or may not have witnessed. If he signed something inaccurately," she said, "that's actually useful to us." Greer looked at her for a moment. "It would be if you could get him to say so." "Would he say so?" The minister was quiet for a long moment. He was thinking about something, and she let him think, because she had learned that pushing Greer produced nothing useful, while waiting him out produced considerably more. "There was a situation," Greer said finally, "some years ago, involving a property transfer that later turned out to have been falsified. The man who orchestrated it was Harlan Teague. Calloway was involved peripherally. The matter was never pursued legally, but the people who knew about it, and I was one of them in a pastoral capacity, were not unaware of what had occurred." Mabel felt something click into place in her understanding of the situation. "Teague has used Calloway before," she said. "It would appear so. And Calloway knows that if the current claim is examined carefully enough, his own involvement in previous irregularities might become visible." Greer looked at her with something that was, she thought, a form of respect. "That would be one way of reading it," he said. "Is there a way to reach Calloway directly?" she asked. "I have a correspondence connection with the minister in Kearney," Greer said carefully. "I cannot guarantee anything, but I can write." "I would appreciate that," she said. She refilled his coffee. She told Silas all of it that night. He sat very still while she talked, which was how he sat when something was costing him more to hear than he expected. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "Greer knew about Teague's history with Calloway," he said. "It appears so." "And said nothing to me." "He said it to me," she pointed out, "over coffee, in a pastoral capacity, as he put it." Silas's jaw tightened briefly. "I've known that man for 4 years. You didn't ask him," she said. "And he's not the kind of man who offers things without being asked. He also probably didn't know how relevant it was until the current situation gave it relevance." He looked at her. "You're defending him." "I'm explaining him," she said. "There's a difference. I'm not saying he should have said it sooner. I'm saying he said it now, and now is what we have to work with." A silence. "You're right," he said, the same way he had said it before, without resentment, just the plain acknowledgement of someone who had updated their assessment. She appreciated that about him more than she had let herself admit. Some men said you were right the way they might concede a chess piece. Reluctantly, strategically, always keeping score. Silas said it like it was simply the accurate thing to say. If Calloway can be persuaded to make a statement that he did not actually witness the transaction Teague is claiming he witnessed, Silas said slowly, that effectively destroys the counterclaim. "Yes," Mabel said, "but getting him to make that statement means he has to admit his own role in the irregularity, which he won't do without some kind of protection. Or some kind of motivation," she said. Greer implied Calloway was not a comfortable man when it came to Teague. A person who's been used once is often afraid of being used again. Silas looked at her. "You think he'd talk to avoid being pulled back in?" "I think he'd talk if someone gave him a way out that felt safer than silence," she said. "I don't know for certain, but it's worth the letter." They waited. Waiting was its own kind of work, and Mabel found that she was better at it than she had previously believed. She kept the kitchen running. She managed the supply levels, which were holding, and the morale, which was also holding, though it required more active maintenance than the supplies did. Men in an uncertain situation needed the ordinary rhythms of their days to remain ordinary. Food on time, fire in the stove, the same voices they expected in the spaces they expected to hear them. Disruption was contagious. So was steadiness. She was steady. The surveyor arrived on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the letter had gone out, on a day when the weather briefly relented and the sky turned the particular pale blue that Nebraska offered as a kind of apology for January. His name was Warren Cole, a lean, weathered man in his 50s who spoke mostly in precise technical observations and seemed to view conversation as an inefficiency. He had a measuring instrument she had never seen before and a map kit that he spread across the kitchen table, temporarily displacing everything else, with the calm self-possession of a man who understood that his work took precedence. She fed him and stayed out of his way. He spent 2 full days on the east section of the property, working in the cold with the systematic patience of someone who had done this in worse conditions and expected to do it in worse still. On the second evening, he came back to the kitchen and laid his findings on the table. The east water boundary sat exactly where the original title documentation said it sat. Teague's claim transfer line was 43 feet inside the actual boundary. The counterclaim, as filed, was geometrically impossible given the verified survey data. Silas looked at the survey findings for a long moment. "Can he file this?" Mabel asked Warren Cole. "With the county recorder, yes," Cole said. "It won't dismiss the claim by itself, but it will require the claimant to respond to the discrepancy. A discrepancy that large is very difficult to explain." She looked at Silas. "File it," he said. The letter from Kearney arrived 6 days later. Not from Calloway directly, from Greer's ministerial contact there, a Reverend Samuel Parks, who had spoken with Calloway and reported back in careful, measured language that Calloway was, in Parks's words, unwilling to make any statement at this time, but not unresponsive to the possibility of further conversation. Silas read this aloud and set it on the table. "That's not a yes," he said. "It's not a no," Mabel said. "What does further conversation mean?" "It means he needs to be talked to in person," she said, "by someone who can give him a clear picture of what saying nothing will cost him versus what saying something might protect him from." "I can go to Kearney," Silas said. She looked at him. "I think you should take Greer." He looked back at her. "Calloway knows Greer," she said. "Parks has already opened the door. If you go alone, Calloway sees a man who wants something from him. If you go with Greer, he sees someone he has an existing relationship with, someone who operates in a framework of confidentiality and trust." She paused. "You need him to feel safe enough to talk. Greer is how you create that." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this all the way through," he said. "I've had time," she said. "Winters are long." He almost smiled. The shadow of it, like before, that came and went before it fully formed. "I'll talk to Greer," he said. The day before Silas left for Kearney, Teague came to the ranch himself. Not to the kitchen door this time. Not to the front porch. He rode directly into the yard with 2 men flanking him and stopped his horse in the center of the space between the house and the barn, in the way of a man making a declaration through geography. Mabel saw him from the kitchen window. She went outside. She was aware as she walked toward him that this was not something she had been asked to do. Silas was in the barn. The hands were at various points around the property. She had made a decision in the 10 seconds it took her to cross the kitchen and open the back door, and the decision was that Harlan Teague was not going to stand in the yard of Iron Creek Ranch and wait for someone to come to him as if the ground beneath his horse already belonged to him. She stopped at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. "Mr. Teague," she said, "Mr. Crowe is occupied. If you'd like to leave a message, I'll see he gets it." Teague looked down at her from his horse with the expression of a man who had expected a different reception. "I'll wait," he said. "This isn't a place for waiting," she said. "If you want a meeting with Mr. Crowe, you ride ahead and arrange one. That's how it works here." One of the men flanking Teague shifted in his saddle. Teague himself did not move, but something changed in his eyes. A recalibration, the same one she had seen when she closed the kitchen door on him weeks ago. "You're the cook," he said. It was said the way some people use that phrase, as a diminishment, a reminder of category. "I run this household," she said, "which means I run this yard. You're in it without an invitation." A silence. She held his gaze. She was not performing bravery. She genuinely was not afraid of him, which was something she took note of because she had been afraid before, in other situations, and she knew the difference. "Tell Crowe," Teague said, "that my offer expires in 5 days." "I'll pass that along," she said. He turned his horse and rode out. The two men followed. She stood in the yard for a moment after they were gone, in the cold, looking at the gate they'd ridden through. Then she went back inside and put the kettle on, because there was no point standing in a cold yard once the thing that required her presence in it was finished. Silas came in from the barn 10 minutes later. He had seen, from the barn door, some portion of what had happened. "What did he say?" Silas asked. 5 days on the offer," she said. "You'll be in Kearney." "Yes." "Then come back with something," she said. She handed him a cup of tea because coffee was already finished for the morning, and tea was what was ready, and she was not going to make a fresh pot of coffee just because the timing was dramatic. He took the cup. "Mabel," he said. She looked at him. "What you just did out there," he started, "was practical," she said. "He was testing whether anyone would come out to meet him. If no one had, it would have looked like an empty yard waiting for a new owner." She turned back to the stove. "I know what empty yards look like. I wasn't going to let him stand there long enough to imagine it." Silas was quiet for a moment. She felt him looking at her in the way he had been looking at her more often recently, with an attention that was different from the careful, assessing gaze she had come to recognize from the early weeks. This was something else, something that had less to do with calculation and more to do with the particular quality of attention a person gives to something they are beginning to understand they do not want to lose. She pretended not to notice, not because she didn't feel it, but because there was a time for things, and this was not yet that time. There was still a counterclaim to defeat. There was still a man in Kearney who needed to say something he was afraid to say. There were still 5 days on a deadline, and fence lines that needed holding, and bread that needed baking, and 12 men who needed to believe that the ground under their feet was as solid as it looked. "Drink your tea," she said. "You've got a long ride tomorrow." He drank it. Outside, February pressed against the walls of Iron Creek Ranch with the particular determination that the month was known for, cold and methodical and patient as a debt collector. Inside, the stove burned steadily. The bread, on its second rise, was almost ready. Silas left for Kearney before sunrise. Mabel heard him go. The particular sound of boots on frozen ground, the creak of the barn door, the muffled negotiation between a horse and a cold morning. She did not get up. She lay in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen that had been hers since October, and looked at the dark ceiling and listened until the hoofbeats faded into the distance and the silence came back and settled. Then she got up and started the fire. The 5 days that followed were the kind that tested a person not through dramatic crisis, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary difficulty. The east pasture fence, which Silas had identified as a problem weeks ago, developed a new weak section on the second day. Not catastrophic, but enough that Pete Dunbar spent an entire afternoon in the bitter cold doing temporary repairs that everyone understood were temporary. The supply of salt pork ran lower than she had projected because 2 of the hands had been eating more than their usual portions, which she had noticed and not yet addressed because she was choosing her moments. The weather turned mean again on the 3rd day. A fast-moving system that dropped 6 inches of snow and made outdoor work miserable enough that the men came in earlier than they should have and sat around the bunkhouse burning through firewood at a rate that she also noted and filed away. She kept all of it running. She did not tell the men that Silas had gone to Kearney about the legal situation. She told them he had business to attend to, which was accurate, and she said it in the tone that indicated the subject was complete, and they accepted it because she had established, over months of daily contact, a particular kind of authority that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with competence. When Mabel Hartwell said something in that tone, you understood that asking more questions would produce no additional information and would also cost you something in her estimation. Nobody asked. On the 4th day, Teague sent a man, not Teague himself, one of the riders who had flanked him in the yard, a younger man with a careful expression and a letter in his coat pocket that he held out to whoever answered the door. Tommy Briggs answered it, looked at the envelope, and came to find Mabel. She took the letter. She thanked Tommy and waited until he was back outside before she read it. It was from Teague's attorney. Formal language, precise structure, the kind of document that was written to be frightening through its vocabulary alone. It stated that the deadline on the purchase offer had been extended by 1 week, which sounded generous, but added a new condition. If the ranch was not sold by the new date, Teague intended to file an injunction blocking any survey documentation from being entered into the county record on the grounds that the survey had been conducted without proper notice to the adverse claimant. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the stove. He was trying to block the survey. It meant the survey had scared him. It meant the 43-foot discrepancy was a bigger problem for his case than he had expected, and he was now trying to seal off the evidence before it could be formally filed. The extension on the offer was not generosity. It was a delay tactic designed to create the appearance of reasonableness while the legal maneuvering happened behind it. She understood all of this clearly and felt the anger of it in her chest, hot and precise, which she preferred to the diffuse, unmanageable kind. She could not respond to the letter. It was not her letter to respond to. It was addressed to Silas Crowe, and she was not Silas Crowe. She could not file anything with the county. She could not accelerate the judge's schedule. She could not go to Kearney. What she could do was make sure that when Silas came back, he came back to a ranch that was still standing in every sense of that phrase, physically, operationally, and in the minds of the men who worked it. She made a large supper that night. Beef stew, which required the last of the good winter beef, but was worth it. Fresh bread. The dried peaches she had been saving for a reason she hadn't identified yet. Cal Moss, who was not a man who commented on food, said, "That's a good stew," which from Cal was a minor event. She kept them at the table a little longer than usual, asking about the fence repair and the horses, and a dispute Pete and Tommy had been having about the best way to fix a specific section of the corral that she did not particularly care about, but understood was the kind of thing that, when given proper attention, reminded men that what they did mattered to the people around them. By the time they went back to the bunkhouse, the mood was steadier than it had been when they'd come in. She was so tired by the time the kitchen was clean that she sat down at the table for 10 minutes before she could make herself get up to go to bed, which was not something she normally allowed herself. But she was 31 years old, and she had been running at full capacity for 4 days with no one to share the weight of it, and 10 minutes at a table was a reasonable concession. She allowed it. Then she got up, banked the fire, and went to bed. Silas came back on the 5th day, late afternoon, with Greer beside him on a second horse and an expression on his face that she could not immediately read. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. She finished what she was doing. She was in the middle of something with the stove that could not be interrupted. And then she went to the window. 2 horses, Silas and Greer. No one else. She went back to the stove. They came in through the back door 10 minutes later, cold from the ride, and she had coffee ready because she had started it when she heard them. Greer sat at the table with his hands around a mug and the posture of a man who was tired in a way that went past physical tiredness. Silas stood near the stove the way he always stood when he was working through something, on the edge of the space, occupying no more of it than he needed. "Calloway talked," Silas said. She looked at him. "He gave a written statement," Silas said, "witnessed by Reverend Parks and notarized in Kearney. It states that he did not witness any transaction between Teague and the previous owner of Iron Creek Ranch, and that his name was added to the counterclaim documentation without his knowledge or consent." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Teague forged the witness signature," she said. "Calloway's statement implies it, without saying it directly," Greer said, from the table. He sounded tired. He was not willing to go so far as to use the word forged, but the statement is clear enough that it removes the witness authentication from the claim entirely. "Without the witness authentication, the counterclaim has no standing," Mabel said. "Our county attorney believes it will be dismissed," Silas said. "Once it's filed with the statement and the survey documentation together, he doesn't think the circuit judge will need more than an hour with the combined filing." She looked at Silas for a long moment. "How did you get Calloway to agree to the statement?" she asked. Silas glanced at Greer. Greer said, "He was more afraid of Teague than he was of telling the truth. We simply adjusted the calculation. We explained, carefully and honestly, that the survey documentation was already filed, and that when the claim was formally examined, Calloway's involvement would be examined as well. At that point, being on record as an unwilling party was considerably safer than being on record as a willing one. You gave him the out I said he needed, Mabel said. You identified the out, Greer said with a precision that she respected. I simply helped deliver it. She poured more coffee. She did this partly because it needed doing, and partly because she needed a moment to let the weight of the last 5 days redistribute itself into something she could set down. Silas was watching her. There's more, he said. She set the coffee pot down. Teague sent a letter while you were gone, she said. His attorney. They're trying to block the survey documentation from being filed. Injunction, on the grounds that the survey was conducted without proper notice to the adverse claimant. She took the letter out of her apron pocket. She had been carrying it for 3 days, and placed it on the table. Silas picked it up. He read it. The muscles in his jaw tightened in a way she had come to recognize as his version of a strong reaction. He knew we were in Kearney, Silas said. He has contacts, she said. You knew that. He moved faster than I expected. Then we file faster than he expects, she said. The statement and the survey together, before the injunction can be processed. How long does an injunction take to go through? Silas looked at Greer. 3 to 5 business days, typically, Greer said, depending on the current load in the clerk's office. Then we have a window, Mabel said. If we file tomorrow morning in Red Hollow, does the county recorder's office have the authority to enter the survey documentation before an injunction from a separate court proceeding blocks it? Greer looked at her with the expression he had used in the kitchen when she first demonstrated how she thought. Technically, yes, he said. Once a document is entered into the county record, a subsequent injunction cannot retroactively remove it. The injunction would have to be filed and served before the entry. Then someone needs to be at the county recorder's office when it opens tomorrow, she said. Both men looked at her. I'm not suggesting I do it, she said. I'm suggesting we decide tonight who does, and they leave early enough to arrive before anything else does. It was Pete Dunbar who went. Not because he was the obvious choice, but because Silas and Greer both needed to rest after the Kearney ride, and Pete had the cousin's surveying connection and understood the documentation well enough to present it without confusion, and because Mabel asked him in the way she asked things, directly, with a clear explanation of what was needed and why, and with the confidence of someone who had already considered whether the request was reasonable before making it. Pete left before dawn. Mabel made him a wrapped meal for the ride and told him to go to the recorder's office first before the feed store or anything else, and to ask for the head recorder by name and not to leave the filing for a clerk to handle. Pete said, I know what I'm doing, Miss Mabel. I know you do, she said. I'm just saying it out loud so we both feel better. He almost laughed. It was the closest she had ever heard Pete Dunbar come to laughing. He left. The hours after Pete's departure were some of the longest Mabel had spent at Iron Creek Ranch, and she had spent some long hours there. She cooked, she cleaned. She managed the morning in the way she always managed it, because the morning needed managing regardless of what was happening at the county recorder's office in Red Hollow. Silas was in the main room when she carried through a plate of food she had made him eat, because he had not asked for anything, and she knew from experience that men in states of tension forgot to do the basic things. He looked at the plate. Eat it, she said. It won't help anything if you make yourself sick worrying on an empty stomach. He ate it. He said after a while, My wife used to say something similar. She sat down in the chair across the room, not at the table, but in the chair by the window that got the morning light. She waited. She said that the body doesn't care what the mind is doing, he said. It still needs what it needs. She was very practical. He looked at the plate. I used to tell her it was one of the things I loved most about her, and she would say that practical wasn't a compliment, and I would tell her I knew that, and I meant it anyway. Mabel looked at him. She sounds like she was clear about things, she said. She was. He set down the fork. Clearer than me in most ways. I tend to make things more complicated than they need to be. I always thought she balanced that. He said it without self-pity. Just the plain, undecorated observation of a man who had spent years being honest with himself about his own nature. The situation with Teague, for example. She would have identified the Callaway angle inside the first week and been 3 steps ahead of where I was. You got to the Callaway angle, Mabel said. Just not alone. He looked at her. No, he said. Not alone. The morning light was doing something particular to the frost on the window, breaking it into small, irregular patterns that were not beautiful in any deliberate way but were interesting to look at. She looked at them. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you told me the night of the windstorm, about your wife, about why you became just Silas." He waited. "I understand it better now than I did then," she said. "Not the hiding, specifically, but the way a loss like that can make a person want to put down the parts of themselves that belong to the person they lost. Because keeping those parts feels like carrying around a weight with no purpose." He was very still. "I had something like that," she said. "Not a person, a situation. I was engaged once before I came to Nebraska. It didn't go the way I expected, and when it ended, I spent about 2 years being someone smaller than I was because the version of me that had planned that life didn't seem useful anymore." She looked at the frosted window. "What I found was that the smaller version wasn't actually more comfortable. It was just quieter, and quiet isn't the same as settled." Silas said nothing for a moment. "What changed it?" he asked. "The work," she said simply. "The kitchen. Needing to be competent for other people. It's hard to stay small when people need you to be capable." She paused. "I expect running a ranch does something similar, if you let it." He looked at her with that particular quality of attention, the one she had been pretending not to notice. "It used to," he said. "It's been starting to again, recently." She stood up and took his plate back to the kitchen, because the moment had reached its natural end, and she was not the kind of person who sat in moments past the point where they were natural. Pete came back in the early afternoon. He came through the back door and straight to wherever Silas was, which turned out to be the barn. And Mabel knew from the speed of his walk that he had news, and she knew from the fact that he was walking rather than running that the news was not a disaster. She waited. Silas came to the kitchen 12 minutes later. "It's filed," he said. "Survey documentation, Callaway's statement, and a formal response to the counterclaim. All entered into the county record at 9:47 this morning." He paused. "Teague's injunction request arrived at the clerk's office at 11:15. She looked at him. "An hour and a half too late," she said. "An hour and 28 minutes, he said. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. She noted this because she had expected them to shake with relief, and they didn't, and she thought this probably said something about her. "The counterclaim will go to the circuit judge when he comes through," Silas said. "But with the survey and the statement both in the record, our county attorney says the dismissal is not in question. It's a matter of paperwork and scheduling." "How long?" she asked. 4 to 6 weeks, he said. "Possibly less if the judge's schedule clears earlier." She nodded. She was calculating the supply situation, the fence situation, the operating cash question he had mentioned weeks ago when the winter had been pressing hardest. "The east pasture fence," she said. "Pete's temporary repairs. How long will they hold?" "Through the rest of February if we're lucky," he said. "Maybe into early March." "Can you get materials for the permanent repair now that the financial situation is clearer?" "Within the week," he said. "Yes." "Then do it," she said. "Don't wait for the legal paperwork. The cattle don't know about the legal paperwork." He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just noting." "Noting what?" He seemed to consider whether to say it. "That you have, for the better part of 3 months, been running this ranch's operational life with exactly the same seriousness you bring to the kitchen. The supplies, the men, the fence, the filing. And you've done most of it without anyone asking you to." She looked at him. "Someone needed to." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm noting." She picked up the pot she'd been about to move before he started talking and moved it, because this was the kind of conversation that required her hands to be doing something. "Don't make me into something I'm not," she said. "I was protecting a situation I'd come to care about. That's practical, not noble." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. She did not answer that. Teague's response to the filing came 3 days later, and it came in a form none of them had anticipated. He came to the ranch himself, not with riders this time, alone. He tied his horse at the post and knocked at the front door with the measured deliberateness of a man who was deciding, in real time, how to behave in a situation that had not gone the way he'd planned. Silas answered the door. Mabel did not go to the front room. She stayed in the kitchen, close enough to the connecting hallway to hear without appearing to eavesdrop, which she acknowledged to herself was a distinction without much moral difference, but which she maintained anyway. She heard Teague's voice, lower than it had been in the yard, more controlled. She heard Silas's responses, brief and measured. The conversation lasted perhaps 12 minutes. She heard the front door close. Silas came to the kitchen. "He's withdrawing the offer," Silas said. She looked up from the dough she was working. "Withdrawing the purchase offer?" "Yes, and he's asked about a different arrangement." He sat down at the table. He looked like a man who had just been handed something heavier than he expected to carry, but was not going to put it down. He wants to discuss a formal water-sharing agreement, not a sale, a use arrangement with compensation. She stopped working the dough. "He pivoted," she said. "He's reading the situation accurately," Silas said, "which I will give him credit for, even though I don't particularly want to." "An arrangement like that," she said slowly. "Does that serve your interests? Actually serve them, not just end the immediate conflict?" "It could," he said, "if the terms were right. If the compensation were fair and the use limits were clear and there was a mechanism for dispute resolution that didn't require going back to court every time something came up." He turned the coffee mug in his hands, a habitual motion she had come to think of as his version of pacing. It could also be his way of getting a legal foothold that the counterclaim couldn't give him. "You'd need an attorney to draft the terms," she said. "Yes. Not the county attorney," she said. "Someone further out. Someone without existing relationships in Red Hollow." He looked at her. "You think the county attorney is compromised?" "I think he's a man in a small community where Teague has money and connections," she said. "I think that's a difficult situation to be neutral in, regardless of good intentions." She paused. "I'm not saying he's dishonest. I'm saying you want a second set of eyes that owes nothing to anyone local." He was quiet for a moment. "I know a man in Lincoln," he said. "We were at school together. He practices property law." "Write him," she said, "before you respond to Teague." "You think I should consider the arrangement?" "I think you should not dismiss it without understanding it clearly," she said. "If there's a version of this that ends the legal fight, secures your water rights on your own terms, and gives you compensation for use, that might be worth more than winning a court case that costs you 4 more months of uncertainty." He looked at her steadily. "And if Teague violates the terms in 2 years?" "Then you have a contract instead of a counterclaim," she said. "A contract is easier to enforce than a disputed historical right." He sat with that for a long moment. She went back to the dough. "I've been running this ranch for 7 years," he said. "I've made every decision about it alone. Even before my wife died, I was the one who made the final calls." He paused. "I don't say that as a complaint. It was what the situation required. But I've been thinking, over these months, that the decisions I've made with someone to talk to have been different, more complete." She didn't stop working the dough. "Different how?" she asked. "Less like I was only seeing one half of the problem," he said. "You see the parts I'm too close to miss." "You see parts I would never think to look at," she said. "That's not a hierarchy. That's just 2 people with different positions." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." Something in the way he said it made her hand slow slightly on the dough, just for a moment. She did not look up. "Write to your man in Lincoln," she said. "Get the terms reviewed before you sit down with Teague again." "I will," he said. He didn't leave immediately. He sat at the table for another few minutes, in the silence that had become, over 3 months, a different kind of silence than it had been at the beginning. Not the silence of 2 strangers carefully avoiding each other's space. The silence of 2 people who had learned which things needed to be said and which were already understood. She shaped the dough into its pan. He got up and went back to work. The letter to Lincoln went out that afternoon. The fence repair materials were ordered the following day. And on a Thursday evening, 10 days after Silas had come back from Kearney, Mabel was cleaning the kitchen after supper when Cal Moss appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had never seen from him before. Something effortful and sincere and slightly awkward, like a man attempting a thing he did not practice often. "I wanted to say something," Cal said. She waited. "The men were talking," he said, "in the bunkhouse, about the situation, about how it went." He turned the hat in his hands. "We know you had something to do with it, the survey thing, and the filing. Pete told us some of it, not all of it." She said nothing. "I've worked on ranches where things went sideways, and the people who ran them, When it got hard, they either panicked, or they left, or they started making decisions that were only good for themselves. He looked at her. You didn't do any of that. You just kept the thing running and figured out what needed figuring out and didn't make a production of it. He paused. I wanted you to know we noticed. The kitchen was very quiet. Mabel looked at Cal Moss, this man who had been on this ranch for years, who ate twice a day at a table she managed, who had said once that the biscuits were not bad, which she had understood as the highest compliment he was capable of delivering. Thank you, Cal, she said. That means something to me. He nodded, put his hat back on, left. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. Then she picked up her cloth and finished wiping down the work table because the table still needed wiping, regardless of the fact that something in her chest had just shifted into a different position. She had been told before that she was good at her work. She had been told it by employers who meant it as a practical assessment, and sometimes by people who meant it warmly. This was the first time she could remember being told it by someone who had watched her do something that went beyond the work itself, and who had seen it clearly enough to say so. She finished the table. She banked the fire. She sat for a moment in the chair at the end of the kitchen and thought about what it meant to be seen by a place. Not by a person, though that too, but by the accumulated weight of months of daily presence, by the routine of meals and fires and difficult conversations, by the way a ranch full of difficult men had slowly, without anyone announcing it, started to treat the kitchen as the center of something. She thought about what it would mean to leave all of it in the spring. She had been trying not to think about that. She thought about it now, just for a moment, in the quiet kitchen with the fire burning low and the Nebraska winter doing its usual pressing against the walls. Then she got up and went to bed, because tomorrow was already accumulating its needs, and she had learned, over 31 years of her particular life, that the most useful thing she could do for any uncertain future was to be fully present in the day that was still in front of her. The walls held. They always held, if you paid them enough attention. The letter from Lincoln arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week that Mabel had first discovered Silas's name on the property record in Red Hollow, and she noted this coincidence without assigning it any meaning, because she was not a woman who looked for signs in the calendar. The attorney's name was Frederick Hale. His letter was 4 pages long, written in the precise, layered language of a man who had spent 20 years thinking carefully about how words on paper could either protect a person or expose them, and who had strong opinions about which outcome was preferable. He had reviewed the proposed water-sharing arrangement that Silas had outlined, and he had, as Mabel had predicted, found several things worth examining more closely. Silas read the letter at the kitchen table after breakfast, when the other men had gone to their work and the kitchen had settled into its mid-morning quiet. He read it the way he read things that mattered, slowly, without moving, with the particular stillness of a man who is doing genuine thinking rather than simply receiving information. Mabel washed the breakfast dishes. When he finished, he set the letter on the table and sat looking at it. Well, she said. He found 3 clauses in Teague's proposed arrangement that would, over time, give Teague the right to expand his use of the water access without renegotiating compensation, Silas said. They're written to look like standard language. They're not standard. She had expected something like this. Deliberately obscured? Hale thinks so. He says the phrasing is, his word was artful, not accidental. She rinsed the last dish and set it to dry. So Teague walked away from the counterclaim and offered a contract that would accomplish the same thing over a longer timeline. Essentially. What does Hale recommend? Counteroffer, Silas said. Strict use limitations, fixed compensation, a renewal clause that requires full renegotiation every 5 years, and a dispute mechanism that goes to a neutral third-party arbitrator rather than the county court. He looked at the letter again. He also recommends a clause that voids the entire arrangement if Teague or his assigns attempt any additional legal action against Iron Creek's water rights within the contract period. She thought about that. Teague won't like the void clause. No, Silas agreed. He won't. Will he accept the counteroffer? Silas was quiet for a moment. Hale thinks he will. His assessment is that Teague has spent considerable money on the counterclaim and the injunction attempt, and that the survey documentation and Calloway's statement have put him in a position where going to court is now more expensive and uncertain than settling. The counteroffer gives him partial access to what he wanted. For a practical man, that's better than nothing. Is he a practical man? She asked. In the end, Silas said. Yes, I think he is. She dried her hands. Then send the counteroffer. The counteroffer went out that week. The waiting that followed was different from the previous waiting, less acute, more like the steady, low-level tension of knowing a thing is in motion and cannot be hurried. Mabel had become, over the course of the winter, familiar with this particular quality of patience, and she had developed a respect for it that she hadn't had before. Patience was not the same as passivity. It required its own kind of daily effort. She kept the kitchen. She managed the supplies, which were holding better now that the east pasture fence had been properly repaired and the cattle weren't requiring the extra attention that poorly contained animals demanded. She had, without entirely planning to, reorganized the storage room in a way that made the weekly accounting faster and reduced the likelihood of the quiet overconsumption she had identified early in the winter. Tommy Briggs had noticed and asked her why she'd moved things, and she had explained it in terms simple enough that he understood immediately, and he had nodded and said that made sense, and then asked if he could help her with anything else, which was Tommy's way of saying he was grateful for being treated like someone capable of understanding something. She said yes, he could help her bring in more firewood. He was gone and back in 10 minutes, carrying more than she'd asked for. Teague's response to the counteroffer came on a Friday, and it was, by any reasonable measure, a capitulation dressed up in the language of negotiation. He accepted the 5-year renewal clause. He accepted the neutral arbitration mechanism. He accepted the fixed compensation rate, which Hale had set at a figure that was fair without being punitive. He pushed back only on the void clause, proposing to narrow it so that it applied solely to water rights claims rather than any legal action, a distinction that Hale, in a follow-up letter, said was acceptable given the specific nature of the existing dispute. Silas read this response sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning, before anyone else was up, and Mabel read it over his shoulder because he held it out toward her without asking whether she wanted to see it, which she took as the answer to a question neither of them had formally posed. She read it twice. "It's done," she said. "Nearly," he said. "The circuit judge still has to formally dismiss the counterclaim. But with Calloway's statement and the survey in the record, that's a formality. When does the judge come through?" 3 weeks, he said. "Maybe less. The county attorney sent word that the docket cleared earlier than expected." 3 weeks. She went back to the stove and started the morning fire, which had burned low overnight and needed building up before the cold of the kitchen made everything harder. 3 weeks brought them to early March. Early March was, by the rough accounting she had been doing in the back of her mind for the past month, approximately the time at which her position at Iron Creek Ranch would reach its natural conclusion. She had been hired as a winter cook. Winter ended. That was how these arrangements worked. She built the fire and did not say any of this out loud. Well, the circuit judge came through on a Wednesday, 12 days later, which was earlier than anyone had predicted, and which the county attorney communicated via a rider who arrived at the ranch in the late morning looking cold and important in equal measure. Silas was in Red Hollow for the formal hearing by noon. Mabel stayed at the ranch and made bread. She was not sure she had ever been more aware of what it meant to stay somewhere and wait. The bread took 2 hours from the second rise to the finished loaves, and she was present for every minute of it in the way you are present for things when your mind has nowhere else comfortable to go. She shaped the dough with the same practiced hands she had been using for 12 years of professional kitchen work, and she thought about nothing in particular, and she tried not to think about what Silas would say when he came back, and she was only partially successful at this. Pete Dunbar came through this kitchen at one point looking for something. Nails, she thought, something to do with the corral, and found her standing at the work table with flour on her apron and an expression that must have said something she hadn't intended to broadcast, because Pete stopped moving and looked at her. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "The nails are in the supply room, second shelf, left side." He went and got them. He came back through on his way out and paused again. "It'll be fine," he said. "Silas is good in a room." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I wasn't worried about the hearing." Pete looked at her for a moment with the careful perception of a man who had been watching people his whole working life and had gotten reasonably good at it. "Right," he said. Then he left. Silas came back in the late afternoon. She heard the horse, and she finished what she was doing, and then she went to the kitchen doorway. He came in through the back door and pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg, and he turned around, and she read his face in the first second. Not the outcome, which was visible in the absence of disaster, but the quality of the moment. He looked like a man who had put down something heavy after carrying it for a long time and was not yet sure how to stand without the weight. "Dismissed," he said, fully and without condition. The judge spent 40 minutes with the documentation and called it one of the most poorly constructed counterclaims he'd seen in 10 years on the circuit. She let out a breath. "And the water agreement?" "Signed this morning before the hearing, filed with the recorder's office after." He moved toward the table and sat down in the middle chair, same as always. "It's over." She poured him coffee. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of late afternoon in a working ranch. The sounds of the place settling into its evening rhythms. The distant voices of men finishing the day's work. The creak and shift of a building that had been through a hard winter and was still standing. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "What does the agreement actually give him?" she asked. "The version that got signed. Regulated access to the East Channel for grazing support. Not irrigation, not diversion, just watering access for cattle during dry months. Fixed compensation at a rate Hale set. 5-year renewal with full renegotiation. And the void clause, narrowed but present." He turned the mug in his hands. "He gets a fraction of what he came for. Less than he would have accepted 6 months ago if I'd offered it at the start." "You couldn't have offered it at the start," she said. "At the start he was trying to take the whole property." "I know," he said. "I'm not saying I should have. I'm saying that's how far he moved." She thought about Harlan Teague, methodical, patient, accustomed to getting what he wanted through the slow application of pressure. She thought about what it had cost him to accept a fraction of his original position, and she thought about whether that meant he was finished or whether it meant he was a man who had learned something and would try a different approach on a different day. "He's not going to be gracious about this," she said. "No," Silas agreed, "but he's not going to come back at the water rights either. The contract makes that too expensive." He paused. "And Calloway's statement is in the public record. Teague knows that using him again carries risk." She nodded. That was, she thought, the more durable protection. Not the legal agreement alone, but the documented evidence that Teague had tried to use a forged witness signature, sitting in the county record where anyone who wanted to find it could find it. That kind of thing had a weight of its own. "It was the survey," she said. "And Calloway. Together, those two things made everything else possible." "Pete's cousin and a minister's correspondence connection," Silas said. "And you going to Kearney?" she said. "And Greer going with you?" "And you identifying every piece of it before I saw it," he said. She looked at him. "We're not going to argue about whose contribution mattered most." "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm accounting. They're the same thing when you do it like that." He almost smiled. The full version this time. Not the shadow of one, but the actual thing, brief and genuine and slightly crooked in the way of a smile that didn't get much practice. She had not seen him smile like that before. She noted it and said nothing. She had planned in a vague and unexamined way to raise the question of her leaving sometime in the week after the hearing. It seemed like the appropriate moment, the crisis resolved, the legal situation settled, the ranch moving toward spring with its operational footing restored. She was a winter cook. The winter was ending. The conversation was straightforward, and she had had versions of it before, on other ranches, at the end of other seasons. She had not anticipated that Silas would raise it first. He came to the kitchen on a Saturday morning, 4 days after the hearing, when the weather had produced one of those rare early March days that felt like a rumor of something better. Not warm, but not brutal either, with a pale sun that had actual presence in it, and a wind that had dropped to something you could stand in without suffering. He came in and poured his own coffee, which he did sometimes now without it meaning anything, and he sat at the middle of the table and he said, "You've been thinking about leaving." She looked at him from the work table. "My position was a winter arrangement," she said. "I know what the arrangement was," he said. "I'm asking what you're thinking about." She set down the thing she had been holding. She turned to face him directly, which was the respect the conversation deserved. "I think about it," she said. "I would be lying if I said I didn't." "What do you think about when you think about it?" She considered the question honestly, because dishonest answers to honest questions were a thing she had stopped being capable of somewhere around the 3rd week of December, somewhere between the locked cabinet and the first real conversation over coffee. I think about the fact that I came here to do a job, she said, and somewhere along the way I started treating it like it was something else. And I'm not always sure what that means, or whether it's wise, or whether the feeling is about the place, or about other things. He looked at her steadily. Other things. Don't make me be more specific than that, she said. I'm not, he said. I know what you mean. A silence, not an uncomfortable one. I want you to stay, he said. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it up. Not because the ranch runs better with you in it, though it does, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but because since October I have been more awake to this place and to what it could still become than I have been in 4 years. And I know that's not entirely about the water rights or the legal situation. He looked at the table, then back at her. I'm not a man who says things like this without meaning them. And I'm not saying it because it's convenient or because it would solve a practical problem. I'm saying it because it's true. She stood very still. 31 years old. She had been proposed to once by a man who had framed it as a solution to a problem, her problem, specifically, of being a woman without property or family money in a world that found such women inconvenient. She had known, even as he said it, that the proposal was kind in its way and meant to help, and she had still felt, afterward, a particular kind of sad that had no clean name. This was not that. This was a man telling her something that cost him something to say. She could see the cost of it in the careful way he was sitting, in the directness of it that left no comfortable ambiguity for either of them to retreat into. I need you to understand something, she said. Her voice was steady. If I stay, it's not because you've decided the ranch is better with me in it. It won't be because I owe you anything, or because I don't have other options, or because it's easier than leaving. She paused. If I stay, it will be because I've decided to. My decision, completely. I know, he said. That's what I'm asking. Not for a favor, for a decision. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the kitchen, which had become hers in the way that places become yours. Not through ownership, but through the daily accumulation of knowing every corner of them. She thought about Pete Dunbar and his cousin in Lincoln, and Cal Moss and his undemonstrative decency, and Tommy Briggs, who said thank you twice a day like it was a practice he intended to keep up. She thought about the east pasture fence, properly repaired now, and the storage room reorganized so the accounting made sense, and the bread she had baked hundreds of times in this kitchen, that was never quite the same twice because the weather and the flour and the fire were never quite the same twice. She thought about a man who had sat in the middle of the table for 11 weeks because he no longer needed to sit at the head of it, who had told her a hard truth about himself over cold coffee in a windstorm, who had said, "You're right," without resentment, who had smiled that crooked, unpracticed smile 4 days ago in a kitchen that smelled like bread and wood smoke and the particular end of a long, difficult winter. She thought about her own question, the one she had been asking herself since the morning she drove home from Red Hollow, with a stone in her chest, and her hands steady on the reins. What kind of person stays, and what kind of person goes? And whether the difference between those two things is courage or fear or something else entirely that she didn't yet have a word for. I'll stay through the spring, she said, and we'll see. He looked at her. That's enough, he said. It's what I can say honestly, she said. I won't say more than that. I don't want more than that, he said. Honest is enough. Spring came to Iron Creek Ranch, the way it always came to the Nebraska frontier, not as an arrival so much as a slow renegotiation. The frozen creek thawed over a period of 2 weeks in March, making a sound in the process that the men called the ice moving, which was exactly what it was, and also somehow more than that. The ground softened, the cattle moved differently, with more range, more ease. The morning started light earlier, and the kitchen stopped requiring quite so much fire to make habitable. Mabel noticed all of it. She had noticed Nebraska's seasons before, on other ranches, but she had always been aware of them the way you're aware of the weather when you're standing inside it, as something happening around you that you manage but don't particularly feel. This spring was different. She was not sure when exactly the difference had started, but she was aware of it now as she went about the work of the kitchen, aware of the particular way the light came through the east window in the mornings, aware of the sound the creek made when it was moving again. She had made a decision in the 4 days between Silas's question and her answer to stop treating her own feelings as something to be managed from a safe distance. It was a decision she had made before and abandoned before, and she was not certain she would sustain it this time. But she was trying. It was the honest thing she could offer, and honest was what she had. The agreement with Teague was formalized in mid-March through Hale's office in Lincoln. Teague did not come to the ranch for the signing. He sent a representative, a quiet man who signed where he was told to sign, accepted a copy of the document, and left without accepting the coffee Mabel had made because it was what you did when someone came to conduct business in your house. She did not take it personally. Pete Dunbar caught her eye from across the kitchen when the representative left and gave a small nod that meant she had come to understand, approximately, good. The economical communications of a man who had decided you were worth communicating with. She nodded back. The east pasture fence held through the thaw without requiring additional repairs, which was the best possible outcome for a fence that had spent the worst months of the year held together by Pete's cold weather improvisation and a degree of determination. Silas rode the fence line in the third week of March and came back with the report that 2 sections would need replacement before the next winter, but that nothing was urgent. He said this at the dinner table to the assembled men in the manner he had developed over the winter of being simply present among them rather than at the head of something. Tommy Briggs said, "We can do the replacement in May. Ground's better then." "Good thinking," Silas said. Tommy looked like a man who had been handed something he wasn't sure how to hold. Mabel, serving from the stove, watched this small exchange and felt something she could only describe as satisfaction. The particular kind that has nothing to do with your own achievement, and everything to do with watching something you've put care into continue to function after the care is given. She had learned, over a winter of running a kitchen through the worst of what Nebraska could produce, that this was actually the best kind of satisfaction. It lasted longer. It didn't require your presence to keep existing. In early April, a letter came for Mabel. It was from her sister in Omaha, the crowded household she had been trying to avoid since the year before, with the sister's husband who meant well, and the 3 children who were loud in the particular way of children who are loved and know it. The letter said, in her sister's cramped, slightly breathless handwriting, that a boarding house in Omaha had an opening for a head cook, full-time, year-round, with a private room and a wage she listed in excited underlined numbers. The sister had put Mabel's name forward, and the owner was interested. Would Mabel come for an interview? She read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen window in the morning light. A year-round position, better money than what she was making. A private room in a city with actual amenities, a doctor, a proper market, a lending library she had visited twice years ago and still thought about. She set the letter on the shelf above the dry goods cabinet, where she put things she needed to think about. She told Silas about it that evening, not because she was required to, because it was the honest thing to do, and she had committed, at least for now, to honesty over comfort. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's a good offer," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you going to take it?" She looked at him. "I'm telling you about it, not announcing a decision." "I understand," he said. "I'm asking what you're thinking." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm, genuinely warm, for the first time since October, because the spring evening was mild enough that the fire was doing the work it was supposed to do rather than fighting against the cold. Outside, she could hear the creak. "I'm thinking," she said, "that a year-round position with reliable wages is something a practical woman should take seriously." "Yes," he said, "she should." "And I'm thinking," she said, "that I have spent the last 6 months building something, and I'm not sure I know what it is yet, and leaving before I know feels like giving up on a question before you've heard the answer." He looked at her across the kitchen. "What question?" he said. She shook her head slightly. "Don't push it, Silas." "I'm not," he said. "I genuinely want to know." She looked at the window, which was dark now, and reflected the kitchen back at them. The stove, the table, the 2 of them sitting on opposite sides of it, as they had been sitting, in various configurations since October. "Whether this is the kind of place that's worth staying for," she said. "The real kind of worth, not the convenient kind." He was quiet for a moment. "What would convince you?" he said. "Nothing you could say," she said. "It's not that kind of question." He sat with that for a moment. "Then what do you need?" he asked. "Time," she said. "Which I've asked for before and you've given." "You can have it," he said, "however much you need. It might mean the Omaha position closes." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice anything. I'm telling you the time is yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're an unusual man," she said. "I've been told that before," he said. "It wasn't always meant as a compliment." "It is this time," she said. She wrote to her sister and said she would let her know within the month. The month was April. April at Iron Creek Ranch was, she discovered, a different place than the one she had learned through winter. The quality of the work changed. Not easier necessarily, but different in character, more outward-facing, with the men spending full days outside rather than retreating to the bunkhouse in the afternoons, and needing the kitchen to be a kind of shelter. The kitchen itself felt different, lighter. She had opened the east window for the first time in 6 months and discovered that the view from it was better than she had realized. A long slope of land running down toward the creek, with the first patches of green beginning to show where the frost had finally let go. She stood at that window more often than was strictly necessary. Silas found her there once, on a morning in the second week of April, when the light was doing something particularly good with the slope of the land and the creek was catching it. He stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Not to change your decision, just because I think you should know it before you make it." She waited. "When my wife was alive," he said, "this ranch was a project we were building together. It had direction because we both knew what we were building toward." He paused. "After she died, it stayed running because I knew how to run it. But it stopped having direction. I told myself that was fine. That a working ranch didn't need direction, it needed maintenance." He looked at the slope of land, the creek. This winter was the first time in 4 years that it felt like it had direction again. "And I know that's not only because of the legal situation, or the water rights, or the practical things you did that kept the whole thing from coming apart." He paused again. "It was because you were here, not managing things from outside, but actually here, inside the difficulty of it, in the way that only matters when a place has to work." She stood at the window and looked at the creek. "That's a large thing to lay on a woman you've known since October," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it to weigh you down. I'm saying it because it's honest, and I decided somewhere around the 3rd week of this winter that the least I owed you was honesty." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the gray, complicated eyes that had been difficult to read in October and were somewhat easier to read now, not because they had become simpler, but because she had learned their language. "I'm not going to Omaha," she said. He was very still. "I decided this morning," she said, "standing at this window. Not because you just said what you said, I had already decided before you came in, but because the question I was trying to answer answered itself." She turned back to the window. "The boarding house in Omaha would have been fine. It would have been reliable and adequate and perfectly fine. And fine is not nothing. I've been grateful for fine before, in situations where fine was all that was on offer." She paused. "But this isn't one of those situations." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "What is this?" She looked at the slope of the land, the creek running clear and cold in the April morning. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'd like to find out." She wrote to her sister that afternoon and said she was staying on at Iron Creek, that the position was going well, and that she hoped the boarding house found a good cook. She meant all of it. She was glad the boarding house existed, and she was glad her sister had thought of her, and she was glad she was not going there. She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing mail, and went back to the kitchen and started the preparations for the evening meal, which was the same thing she had done every evening for 6 months, and which felt, this particular evening, subtly different, not in the work itself, but in the quality of her presence in it, like the difference between standing in a room and living in one. There is a thing that people don't say often enough about the kind of work that keeps other people's lives running. The cooking and the mending and the fire building and the supply counting and the 10,000 small decisions made before anyone else is awake. It gets called practical. It gets called necessary. Sometimes it gets called thankless, by people who mean well but have missed the point. The point is that it's foundational. A foundation isn't visible, and it doesn't announce itself, and nobody stands around admiring it once the building is up. But without it, nothing else holds. Mabel Hartwell was 31 years old, and she had been building foundations her entire working life, and she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, through more failures than she would have chosen, that the question was never whether the work mattered. The work always mattered. The question was whether the place you were doing it mattered. whether the people who walked across the foundation knew, in some wordless way, what was underneath them. She had found, at Iron Creek Ranch, a place that knew. She had found, which she had not expected, a man who also knew, who had been building his own kind of foundation in relative silence for 7 years, and who had needed someone to stand in the same place and understand what they were both looking at. Neither of them were whole people who had become wholesome under good conditions. They were imperfect people who had been worn into themselves by hard use and who had found, in the most unremarkable setting possible, a working kitchen, a shared table, a winter that demanded everything they had, that the shapes worn into them happened to fit against each other in ways they could work with. That was not a fairy story. That was something better, something real, with friction in it and history in it and no guarantee of anything except the chance to keep trying. So, in June, when the east pasture fence was being replaced, Tommy Briggs had been right about the timing. The ground was better. Silas asked Mabel to walk the fence line with him. Not because she needed to see it. She knew what a fence line was. He asked because it was a thing he wanted her to see, this particular piece of the ranch, now properly built and standing straight in the summer light. They walked it together, out along the east boundary where the creek ran and the new fence post stood solid in the ground that had held them through worse than anything coming. At the far corner, where the fence met the water boundary, the exact line the survey had confirmed, 43 feet from where Teague had tried to claim, Silas stopped. "This is the line," he said. She looked at it. Just posts and wire, and the ground beneath them and the creek beyond. "It doesn't look like much," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't. But it's yours." "It's mine," he said. And then, after a pause that was not quite long enough to be a hesitation, "Ours, if you want it to be." She looked at the fence line and the creek and the sky above the eastern section of Iron Creek Ranch on a June morning, with the sun doing what the sun does when it has finally earned its place back after a long winter. She looked at the man standing beside her. "Ask me properly," she said, "not in passing." He turned to face her. He asked her properly. She said yes, not because the ranch was impressive, or because the water rights were secured, or because the legal situation had resolved in their favor. Not because it was practical or convenient or the obvious next step in any story someone else might tell about them. She said yes because she had stood in difficult places and learned to know the difference between a thing that was fine and a thing that was true, and this was true, and she was 31 years old, and she had worked too hard for too long to mistake one for the other. They were married in September, in the front room of Iron Creek Ranch, with Reverend Greer officiating and all 12 ranch hands present, including Cal Moss, who stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man attending an event he had no vocabulary for but which he had concluded was worth attending. Tommy Briggs cried a little. He was not embarrassed about it. Pete Dunbar shook Silas's hand and said, "Good," which from Pete was a complete sentence. The food was, naturally, exceptional. Mabel had made it herself, with help from Tommy and Pete's reluctant assistance, because she was not the kind of woman who handed off the kitchen on a day that mattered. Silas had offered to bring someone in from Red Hollow to cook, and she had looked at him in a way that settled the question. The party lasted into the evening, which was cool and clear, with the creek audible from the open front door and the stars doing what stars do over open Nebraska country in September, which is everything they can, without reservation, because there is nothing up there to stop them. Mabel stood in the kitchen doorway at the end of the evening, looking out at what was hers. Not in the legal sense, though that too, but in the sense that matters more, known and tended and understood from the inside. She had come to Iron Creek Ranch as a hired cook, carrying 2 bags and a reference letter and a practical determination to make the position work until something better came along. Something better had not come along. Something real had come along instead, which was different and harder, and worth considerably more. That was the thing she would carry from this place and this year, not the story of a woman who was tested and passed, because she had never agreed to be tested and passing was not the point. The point was simpler and less dramatic than that. She had shown up every day and done the work the day required, and stayed present in the difficulty of it, and refused to be smaller than she was when the situation made smallness seem like the safe choice. The work had held her, and she had held the work, and in the holding something had been built that neither of them could have built alone. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only thing that